Okay, everybody, I hope you had a nice coffee break. It seems like it was very successful. Lots of talking, lots of chattering. I saw some people taking photos with each other. This was such a wonderful start to our morning. And now I want to bring us to this next realm of the invisible opponent that a lot of student athletes face. It's so interesting. That last panel we heard Jeff and Kaylin and Charlie talk about this concept of identity. Identity, who am I? It's never, by the way, anyone listening, it's never too early to ask that question. People around you, it's never too early to start prompting that question because that's an investigative pursuit that will last them and serve them for the rest of their lives. That's a tree of life that will keep giving to them. And now we understand, once you know who that person is that you want to be, or the person that you are, who's trying, or what forces are around you that are trying to detract from that? Who are you playing against, right? And as an athlete, you're always thinking, okay, well, who am I playing against? Who's on the field with me? And in this battle, there is the invisible opponent. So with that, I want to welcome in Dr. Kevin Chapman, who is a licensed clinical psychologist and founder and director of the Kentucky Center for Anxiety and Related Disorders, where he specializes in the assessment and treatment of anxiety and related disorders. Dr. Chapman is a diplomat and certified by the Academy of Cognitive Behavioral Therapies and is a nationally recognized expert in the implementation of cognitive behavioral therapy for anxiety and related disorders. Additionally, Dr. Chapman serves as a consultant for the creation of evidence-based anxiety treatment protocols due to his additional expertise related to the intersection of multiculturalism and mental health. Similarly, Dr. Chapman has published numerous papers in scientific journals and has written several book chapters. He's a faculty member for the Behavior Therapy Training Institute for the International OCD Foundation and serves on its clinical and scientific advisory board. He also serves on several editorial boards, including those for the Journal of Anxiety Disorders and Clinical Child and Family Psychologist Review. Previously, Dr. Chapman served as an associate professor in clinical psychology. He also regularly contributes to and serves as a consultant for multiple media outlets, including A&E. And along these lines, he's also on the Psychology Expert Media Panel for the Coalition for the Application and Advancement of Psychological Science. Most recently, he was the program psychologist for seasons 1 and 2 on A&E's hit documentary, 60 Days In, if you saw that. And he has been featured in U.S. News and World Report, USA Today, NBC Health, Bloomberg Business Week, Men's Health, and on other numerous outlets. Dr. Chapman also serves as a team psychologist for the Louisville City Football Club and the Racing Louisville Football Club. Prior to his current work, he had completed a BS in psychology from Center College, a MS in clinical psychology from Eastern Kentucky University, and a PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Louisville. Without any further ado, take it away, Dr. Chapman.
Thank you all. Thank you. We good? Most importantly of all that, though, I'm one of the TrueSport experts, and I'm so thrilled to be here. It's always a privilege and an honor to be able to share with you all. We all have the same goals in mind. And I'm excited about this panel. Anybody else excited? Are you all getting some good information while you're here? All right, well, we're just getting started, right? It's been fire so far, but this is going to be very good. So this is going to be kind of a unique panel because ultimately what we're going to do in this what we call lightning round is we're going to do a series of mini presentations that sets the stage for a panel later on called the Solutions Panel, all right? So I'm the occasion setter for my esteemed colleagues. I'm gonna be talking about various problems, and I'm gonna set the table. If you like food, I love food. Anybody like food? Yeah, right? So I'm gonna set the table and be more conceptual to prepare you for what they're gonna talk about as it relates to many of the problems that we see with our student athletes, all right? So this is called the invisible opponent. And that's an aptly named title for a lot of reasons because you know the theme here is we're contending for student-athlete well-being. So here's what I want us to do for a minute. If you don't mind, I want everybody to close their eyes just briefly. And depending on your roles, most of us have many roles as parents, coaches, athletes, but pick your primary role, right? And I want you to think about your athlete, you being the athlete, you being on the pitch, the court, being in the water, whatever it may be. And you've done everything you can to train for this moment. You've prepared yourself mentally, you've prepared yourself physically, you feel ready, game day, no anxiety, and you're ready to roll. But you're facing an opponent who calculates every move that you have. Despite how much harder you try, despite what tactic you try to change, if you're a coach, you're saying, let's try this, it doesn't work. So you find yourself very frustrated and dejected Because everything that you've learned for that moment in time is not working for this opponent. You watched all the film you could, and it still didn't work. So you can open your eyes now. That's essentially what we call an invisible opponent. So essentially what we mean by that is that you're facing an opponent that you know exists, but it's negatively affecting not only your performance, but your mental health and well-being off the field. And that's what we're talking about today, is you know it's a problem, and yet every tactic you've learned is ineffective, right? That would be frustrating, would you agree? So the question that we have to ask is, what are these invisible opponents, and how does that affect a student athlete and their well-being, right? So we're setting the table right now. What are these invisible opponents, and how does that negatively affect our student athlete and their well-being, all right? So with that being said, again, conceptually, in order to understand these things, you have to understand the culture. You have to understand the culture in which sports occur, right? Without that understanding, we can do very little to help our student athletes, okay? So when I talk about culture, what I'm really referring to is something, there was a term that was coined in 1938 by Murray. We're talking about a concept known as achievement motivation. Stick with me, this is very important, because it does set the table for where we're going. Achievement motivation. Really, achievement motivation is about effort. What kind of effort, Kevin? Well, what I'm referring to when I say effort is a person's effort, right, to master a task, right, to achieve excellence, to overcome obstacles, which were talked about in previous panels already, right, to perform better than other people, right, and to take pride in exercising, right, your talent. That's what we call achievement motivation. Now, here's what you need to understand about achievement motivation in a student athlete. We tend to think about achievement motivation with two different concepts. One, we have our society as a whole and the culture therein. We have what we call an individualistic society, me. So in other words, my output, my outcome, the value is about me, right? So I value the individual, right? We also have what's called a collectivistic culture, which values we, right? The group as a whole. You with me? So we have the individualistic culture, we have the collectivistic culture. So when we talk about achievement motivation, we tend to think about achievement motivation from those two facets. Here's the problem though. Our athletes are diverse. They come from diverse backgrounds. They come from diverse homes and family arrangement and involvements, right? So ultimately we find that as student athletes proceed, they tend to share values from both. So in sports culture, we often value the team, right? Which is very collectivistic, but the problem and the disconnect is that many of our student athletes are expected to perform at a high level, right? And yet it conflicts with their culture of origin. So that creates a significant problem. And guess what? The United States is the highest in the world in individuality, and yet it's also the highest in achievement motivation, right? We're all about performance. We're all about outcome. We're all about success. What gets the scholarship? It's not the process, it's the outcome. Yet we preach process. You with me? There's a significant disconnect, you all, right? So ultimately, those things negatively impact our student athletes' well-being. Case in point, according to cognitive theory, we all, okay, develop what we call the cognitive triad. And what that is we learn early on in life to think about ourselves, the world around us, including other people, and our future. Now, if you come from a stable background, right, that tends to be like, I'm adequate, I'm competent, I'm loved, right? Other people also care about me, and my future is predictable, right? It's optimistic. But if you come from chaos and you have mixed messages, that can really be altered, right? Like, I'm unlovable. People will take advantage of me, and my future is uncertain. You with me? So we all learn these three facets of thinking about ourselves as it relates to the world around us and the future. Now, the issue is keep in mind that, and I think Dr. Candace mentioned this earlier. So again, she threw it off the glass and I'm catching it. So she mentioned this ecological model. Now think about an athlete, right? So we all receive these messages, but we as athletes ultimately learn these attitudes and beliefs early on in life, right? About ourselves as athletes, but also who we are as a person, right? But that interacts, if you will, with other messages. The micro system, meaning our coaches, our teams, the trainers, the staff, right? Our family of origin and whatnot. But then we have the sport as a whole, the exosystem, like the sport culture itself. And then we have, depending on the stage that we're on, what we call the macro system. National media, social media, because we all know that's not a problem for anybody in this room, right? All of those things interact and influence the beliefs we have about ourselves. Now, I want you to think about that as it relates to a student athlete, right? Because I think about myself a certain way, others a certain way, and my future a certain way. Student athletes today are getting messages from all over the place. And this can have a tremendously negative or positive effect on how they proceed in their sport and outside of the sport. Is this making some sense? You with me? Okay, so this is presenting somewhat of an issue. In fact, so much so that, as we've alluded to as it relates to mental health and wellness, it's that 40 million Americans a year, for example, are diagnosed with an anxiety disorder, right? Only 1/3 of those people receive treatment. And if you want to talk about adolescents, 1 in 5 will have a mental disorder of some point, right? At some point in their lives and of some sort, right? 14% of them will be depressed, and 25% of them will have an anxiety disorder. Yes, I said 25%. But you know what's more alarming than that for you all? Our elite level student athletes are in those numbers, and there's no exception. These numbers are staggering, right? So ultimately, we have a problem, right? And I'm just setting the stage for that. So we have a problem. So I say that to say that the intent that we have for this panel and for the rest of the summit that you're going to be at is we want to make this more like this. We want to take what's invisible and make it visible. We want to take what we find today and the information that we gain throughout the summit and make it actionable items, right? Theory sounds good, but if it's not practical, it's idle, right? So ultimately, what we're going to do with this panel is my colleagues and I essentially are going to talk about some of these problems and highlight them with the intent of solutions, right? So we're going to cover in a second, we're going to talk about identity, the importance of identity. You've seen that theme already. So we're going to highlight facets of identity, right? So that's one principle that we're going to discuss. We're also going to talk about something that I would deem as the elephant in the room. How are we preparing our student athletes for the present and the future, right? We know the saying, once an athlete, always an athlete. I do agree with that, but how many of y'all know we have different facets of our identity? How are we preparing our athletes for the next stages of life, right? Okay, so we're also gonna talk about overcoming obstacles, right? We've mentioned resiliency with Dr. G and things like that. So overcoming obstacles, but as they relate specifically to overcoming injury, right? That's a very important concept. We heard that on the athlete panel. See how this is all coming together? And finally, we're gonna also talk about how do we help student athletes manage not only expectation, but the pressure that they inevitably have coming from different angles. All right, y'all excited? We want to get into it? All right, so I'm going to get my colleague, Dr. Mel. She's going to come up. She's going to introduce herself, and we're going to get into some identity talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. This big one switches. Okay. All right. Well, it's so great to be here. Thank you, Kevin. I'm Dr. Melissa Streno, licensed clinical sports psychologist and the TrueSport body image expert. I am from Denver, Colorado, not very far, and have a private practice down in Denver, working both mental performance, sport and performance psychology, and then general clinical psychology, all kind of under the umbrella of eating disorders, disordered eating, and body image issues. So we are going to kick it off today. Who am I? Identity issues faced in sport, and specifically looking at how is body image in sport connected to one's identity. So from a very young age, it's very common for sport culture, sport routine, really to be all that one knows. And we know specifically when one starts to specialize in sport from an early age, this magnifies the connection with identity to sport. We know that there's a predisposition for developing a negative body image issues, eating disorder behaviors, or full-blown diagnosed eating disorders with certain sports that have an aesthetic component, an endurance component, a weight factor. That's not to say that other sports that aren't under those categories don't predispose or have anyone who struggles with any of those issues at all. Sports schedules, routines are enveloped in sport. So when you think about weekends, evenings, and I've even seen in my practice, I don't know about you all, but athletes who are coming to school late, leaving school early to get to some sports-specific event, whether that's a training session, an extra strength and conditioning, speed camp, whatever that might be. And so all of our time starts to really focus around getting ready for sport, and all really starts to contribute to our identity. So all this planning, routines, everything that's involved in sport training starts to shape and mold kind of who the athletes are. Over time, coaches' expectations, personal expectations, demands on the body, and eventually a relationship with food, exercise, and what that relationship with how they look like, their body image, and that achieved ideal that we'll talk about a lot in this presentation, starts to influence the identity as well. Support systems, so everyone's kind of support bubble, who they see as very safe, very nurturing, very connecting, somebody that they can go to, kind of somebody they would want in their court. They become all of the people who are connected to sport. Over time, this can very much influence pressure and expectation. Coaches, teammates, parents, trainers, strength and conditioning coaches. And then from there, that really starts to breed this comparison and competition tendency. And so we're getting all this feedback and all this pressure from the people that we have in our court, our support system, the people we will go to, the people we know are there for us when we need something. And they're also very much tied to this pressure and expectation when it comes to doing well. And that is tied to the comparison, the competition tendencies, and can very much negatively contribute to that body image ideal. All right, it looks like one of the slides might be off, but I can fill in for that. So essentially what the next line is supposed to be about is our bodies. So our vessels, our vehicle that as athletes we kind of navigate these twisted and kind of windy roads through the sport experience and the life of sport experience. Unfortunately, they very much contribute to a negative and damaging perception of body image over time. Okay, so where do specific numbers play a role in an athlete's identity? And some of you might be thinking like jersey numbers, bib numbers. No, I'm talking specifically about numbers on a scale, clothing sizes, body composition results. These become almost in a very twisted and irrational way kind of badges of honor that athletes really start to identify themselves by. Turton and colleagues in 2017 found that a high athletic identity really increased the chances of disordered eating behaviors, and specifically they were looking at compulsive exercise. So what this tells us is that a strong athletic identity mixed with what we maybe would describe as kind of an obsessive passion, like determination, commitment, really that drive to do well in your sport, can very much contribute to some negative relationships with exercise specifically, whether that's over-exercise, not fueling enough, and put undue pressure on expectation for how a body is supposed to perform, what it's supposed to execute. Ron Thompson, very well-known researcher in this field, kind of father of eating disorders in sport, describes identity as a sense of attachment, describes identity and a sense of attachment as advantages and something protective in sport. So when we think about stressors in sport, routine in sport, expectations, like I mentioned earlier, from coaches, from teammates, all of that, we can see that as protective because it's connecting and it keeps us all part of something, but at the same time, it can be very damaging and detrimental to how we see ourselves, how we see our body, and what that relationship with our physical body looks like. Okay, so for you all to think about, take a minute and pause on the statements below. Reflect for I'll give you 30 seconds because we are trying to fit in a lot of great stuff in this presentation. The first one is, I feel blank if I'm unable to exercise. When I'm done exercising, I feel blank. I'm allowed to blank after my workout is complete, and I exercise because blank. So I want you to think about this in whatever capacity you're related to sport, whether it was in the past, whether it's current, exercise activity, whatever that looks like, and just take about 30 seconds. That was great. Okay. I'm sure that this could be a discussion that could go on for hours in terms of what came up for everyone, or maybe certain instances with athletes that they thought about. But the reason I put this up there is really just to show kind of what I look at when I'm gauging, like, how much is exercise playing a role in somebody's life? How much is one's identity becoming dependent on what their exercise looks like? how much they work out, what they can lift, what they allow themselves to do, if they do it, if they don't. And this is not just in everyday activity and exercise or going to the gym after work if you have time. This is also for our elite athletes. This is for our youth athletes. This is something really to think about, to kind of get into the lens and kind of the funnel that maybe some of the athletes that you're working with or that you have worked with in the past might be going through. All right, so we'll complicate this a little bit further. Athletes have a body image in and out of sport, and we heard this from the wonderful panel before as well, and they spoke so well to this. One of the confounding factors in De Bruin and colleagues' article in 2011 is that they found that athletes possess both a social and an athletic body image. So to feel okay, athletes are having to conform to the standards within their sport, which includes those body image ideals, as well as the standards to life outside of sports. So when they leave the pool, they leave the track, they leave the gym, whatever that might be, the court, they have all these other realms of their life: family, relationships, school, work, and there's a standard, there's an expectation of physical appearance in each of those realms. So for example, maybe a volleyball, basketball player, their whole life they're praised for being very tall, great vertical, it's helped you be so successful, that's amazing. And then when I'm talking to them in my office, they're like, yeah, it's really great, but there's other parts of my life that being really tall is hard. Dating, it's uncomfortable, I wanted to date this person, it limits my dating pool. Certain clothes, now these are anecdotes, I know these are generalizations. These are more anecdotal statements. But it is something to be very, very aware of, and definitely something that in the world of eating disorders, disordered eating, and body image, that we have to, when we're looking at the big picture of who is this person in sport, it's so important to make sure we're also looking at how are they doing and who they are outside of sport as well. The P word, perfectionism, pervasive in the sport world, and most notably when we're thinking about body image and body image ideal. If one is never truly satisfied with who they are, how are they able, and if they're always striving to be better, that it's never enough, I think we hear that a lot, can they truly ever connect to their authentic self, the things that drive them, their motives, the things that get them out of bed every single day? As we live in this world that's embracing, and I put healthy in quotes and healthy exercise, I'm talking talking about fad diets, talking about certain exercise, regimens that are supposed to do certain things, obviously diets, all of that. We're really setting up an unhealthy relationship between diet and exercise that transforms into a statement of character and identity. And this is an unhealthy relationship because no amount of exercise and no amount of food makes somebody good or better or more worthy. And no amount of food and no amount of exercise makes somebody worse, bad, or unworthy, not having value. Comparison tendencies are also something that I think is really important to talk about when we think about perfectionism. The pressure to do well and the attention surrounding body image, especially in comparison to others, really can combine for a detrimental merging. And then finally, the impact of transitioning out of sport on one's identity. So one's sport transition or one's sport career is coming to a close. Maybe they're sidelined by injury, they graduate, they don't make a team, they're cut from their team, whatever it might be, but they go through a really challenging period of time of figuring out, who am I now? Am I going to be able to nourish my body in the same way with the activity or the exercise that I engage with? What does my relationship with my body look like? Who am I to my teammates relationally? What does this look like? There was an interesting article, or interesting research study that was then published that looked at athletes who had transitioned out of sport so 5 months post their transition, post their athletic career transition. And they found that there were 5 months post decreased body satisfaction scores, which makes sense, right? They're not competing and training as much. So maybe they're starting to notice physical body changes, but they're also noting like ability shifts. Maybe I'm not able to lift as much, not able to run as fast. But the thing that I found the most interesting, and I love to highlight because it's important, is that they also found that athletes, when they describe themselves in sport after a really hard game or a hard practice, their body was like really sore, they were really tired. They said that's high performing, that's expected. I'm putting everything out there, leaving everything out there, and that's how I should feel. I'm a high performing athlete. 5 months post-transition, when they had a hard workout or felt really sore, or maybe hadn't done an activity or type of exercise in a while, and experienced that physically the next day, they described it as suffering. So in 5 months, these athletes are describing themselves, their identity, who they are, as high performing. to suffering. So now they're grouped into these masses of everyday, and I say non-athletic in the sense of like not elite, competing all the time, full-time job, and feeling totally lost. McPherson, 1980, said this is just the loss of being socially significant, right? So not having those accolades, the praise, everything that they were used to, the attention, that support bubble that we talked about earlier on. So the impact of a physically changing body after sport on one's identity and body image can be very, very significant. Interpersonally, they feel lost. Who am I going to connect with? What am I going to do when my teammates move away? Or maybe I'm leaving. What is that going to look like? Who am I going to spend time with? Who am I going to call? But also relationally with their own body. You know, how am I going to develop a relationship with food, with exercise, but most notably with my body, what it allows me to do, what it stands for, what's my body's purpose at this point? I think those are the questions I hear all the time. And then finally, this might be the only like positive and maybe lead into solution, is that I think a lot of institutions right in this area, we're very lucky I think with the USOPC, but a lot of institutions and organizations are trying to implement support in terms of what this looks like for athletes when they're transitioning out of sport. And I see a trend going that way, so I feel encouraged, I feel hopeful, but it's definitely not enough, and I think we've heard that already today, we'll hear more of it. But when somebody's in sport, the attention, the energy, the effort, the time is everything on the present, the here and now, performing, accomplishing, achieving, producing. And so it's not as common as it should be or as available to have somebody there to hear the fears or the concerns or the what ifs of what does my life look like once sport is over. And so as a result, it very much influences this idea that to be seen is to be an athlete and to be in the body that they are in when they are competing. I'm very excited to hand it over to my colleague, Erin Haugen. Oh, sorry.
Yay, references. I love references. One of the hard parts about being a presenter is that we don't actually get to like jot notes here, actually, which I really, really love. There we go. We're changing it up.
I don't trust easily, so I'm going to come down, actually. Let me get back a little bit, if I'm able to go back. Spoiler alert. So my name is Charron Sumler. I use she, her pronouns. I am currently an athletic counselor at The Ohio State University, and I'm currently working on my PhD in counselor education. So we heard from Dr. Candace earlier, and I had the pleasure of working with her for the last 3 years before her wonderful journey with the Celtics. And she left some big shoes to fill, so I always like to acknowledge the people that came before me. Today, I'm going to be talking about social media. And so there's not a lot of research on how social media impacts student athletes, and particularly their mental health, but it's important that we understand what's happening. So this is a survey that was done in both 2014 and 2022, and it showed that a variety of things that we see. Something significant that stands out to me, something significant that stands out to me is that a number of these apps, these social media apps, weren't even around or being used by 13 to 17-year-olds in 2014 and 2015. Which means it's just really hard to understand what's happening because social media changes so fast and what our consumers are using changes a lot. And so for teenagers right now, which this is a surprise to me, 95% of 13 to 17-year-olds use YouTube primarily. As a mid-millennial, that blows my mind because YouTube for me was mostly just for like how-to tutorials when you just needed to see how something was built or created, and now people are using it for entertainment purposes. So there's not a lot of data behind this, but we know that YouTube and TikTok are really coming up in the last 2 or 3 years as the main users or the main apps that athletes are using and that students are using. So to get to a little bit more into student athletes specifically, so there was a study done in 2021 that did look at social media use by student athletes. And I think the most challenging thing about social media with athletes is that there are tangible risks and benefits. So to look briefly at these benefits, many of them reported that with their busy schedules and limited time, social media is how they stay connected to family and friends, and that's important. We want them to foster that sense of community and have outlets outside of their sports. However, it comes at some cost that we need to understand. And particularly in COVID-19, for all of us, there were so many social media challenges and ways to get involved and stay connected. So it's something we can't avoid, it's something we need to learn how to live with, because it is helpful. Another way that social media is being used in a positive way for student athletes is recruitment and NIL, name, image, and likeness. So 30% of name, image, and likeness deals, and these are deals that student athletes are able to get to make money, 30% of those deals involve social media posting, reposting, and tweeting of these brands. So student athletes are using social media to make money as well with NIL, so it's something that we also, again, have to learn to live with because it's helping them right now. And coaches aren't shy of this. They're using it for recruitment purposes. So we've seen an increase in coaches and administrators using social media to showcase their facilities, their talents, their operations, their resources. And so coaches they're basically saying, if we can't beat them, let's join them. And so we're seeing it on both ends of it, where social media is being used both to recruit student athletes, but also for student athletes to get deals. And then lastly, student athletes talked about motivation and stress. So many of them use social media as a way to stress relief. So they're on the go, they're constantly moving. They said they were able to watch movies or engage in positive podcasts or look at helpful tips on managing their mental health. So social media was useful for them in that way. And for some, and particularly males, motivation. They use social media to see what the competition's doing, see what facilities are out there, see what the strength coaches are doing, learn mobility tools and tricks and resources. So it is helpful in increasing their resources, but again, we have to understand at what cost. And that's what we're really gonna focus on today. I boiled it down to 3 main costs, the 3 C's, and it's not just because my name starts with a C, Charron. It's control, coping, and comparison. Before we get into that, though, I wanted to highlight with some visuals the benefits and the risks of social media. So earlier this year, Harry Miller shared his story with mental health, his mental health journey publicly, and it was well received and went viral. He inspired tons of thousands of people and student athletes to share their mental health journeys, and it really continued to destigmatize mental health. Social media is a really helpful tool to use to destigmatize mental health, as we saw with Harry Miller. However, on the flip side, earlier this year as well, E.J. Liddell, men's basketball player at Ohio State, he was cyber bullied basically for losing the March Madness, losing the game early in March Madness. So he received death threats. People threatened to come to his college residence and hurt him. Derogatory racist slurs were shared to him, and he went public because he said, we have to learn about what's happening with these cyber bullies out there. We need to basically fight back. But unfortunately, he did not have the same control that Harry Miller had. So these cyber attacks came directly during the game and right after the game. So even before he has an opportunity to reflect himself on the game, he's getting attacked, getting death threats, and looking for resources and support. So the control piece, I talked about that. So when we think about social media, there's control in the information that we consume, and there's control out, what we put out there, kind of what we share on our news feeds, et cetera. So with control in, the risk factor here is fan emotions and criticism. And I'm a former college athlete. I played Division II basketball over a decade ago at this point, and this is not something that I had to think about twice. So those fan emotions, right? So back in the day, I can't believe I'm saying that now, but back in the day, when people were upset about games, they could call into the radio and complain and moan, or they could type and write to the newspaper, right? But people didn't really do that. By the time they spent time to do that, they were able to regulate their emotions. Right now with social media, there is zero. So fans are also not regulating their emotions. They're going straight to these athletes and kind of dumping their emotions directly onto these athletes because they have access to them. So that's a tricky piece of that control in, is we don't have a lot of control of what's coming in. The control out piece is kind of going into that pressure. There's some performance anxiety coming with social media, the pressure to perform as a brand. So when they get these deals, like I said, 30% of these NIL deals involve social media posting. During the game, they're worried about what they're going to repost after the game. And this is true. This is what they talk to us about. They are worried about how they're going to reframe something that happened in the game and post better, how they're going to engage with their fans after the game. So it's no longer just the game. We have to really include everything that goes into being a student athlete today. And I would say in terms of the mental health implications of control, anxiety is a disorder about fear and the lengths that we will go to control that fear. And the issue here is there's a lot of anxiety because we can't control it. Social media likes to give us the impression that we're in control, that we can turn off notifications and do these different things. We're still not. We still cannot control what comes across that screen, even if it's from a positive source or a positive follower. Coping. So I'll start with the one on the left, sleep. There have been a lot of research that shows the relationship between nighttime social media use and decreased levels of self-esteem. We're still not really sure why that exists. We can take some guesses, but nighttime social media use is often used by people who have a lot of racing thoughts, have a lot going on, a lot of stressors. They're using social media to quiet their brain, they think, but they're actually feeding it. So it's feeding that anxiety. It's distracting them right before bed. And we already know with student athletes, many of them are not prioritizing their sleep or don't have the time to prioritize sleep. You throw social media in there, and we have a bigger problem.
Yep.
Anybody recognize this guy? Oh, I'm honored. This is TikTok's feature. He would come on and say, hey there, you've been scrolling for way too long. You should take a break. This was TikTok's attempt to try to get people to moderate their use of their own app. Can you believe that? That would be like a beer company trying to tell you how to regulate your consumption because they know it's so bad. So TikTok created this to help users become more mindful and more aware of how long they were scrolling, because hours can go by, right? So this is, again, it's diminishing. Social media diminishes our student athletes' ability to regulate their emotions, because they are tied to it, and just the scrolling keeps going faster. The algorithms are getting even more specific to what you're interested in to keep you hooked and keep you watching. And so that's the problem we have with student athletes right now in terms of social media, is they're using it in social situations when they feel uncomfortable. They pull their phone out, right? And they're using that instead of dealing with those emotions. I was on the flight here. I had the honor and privilege of sitting behind a 2-year-old on a long, early flight, and he had some big emotions. That's fine, right? Mom was handling it. She was rocking with him and soothing him. 5 minutes later, she did it. She pulled out the device. And he went from like flailing to completely focused. And I was like, this is it. It's happening as early as 2. So it starts with devices in front of our young ones. It escalates into social media. Someone said their 3-year-old knows how to get to YouTube. And I was like, that is wild to me, right? But this is how bad it is. It's starting so young, of that reliance on devices and external stimuli to regulate our own emotions. And then the last piece, we talked a lot about comparison, and that's the biggest thing that people focus on with social media, is the comparison trap. I mentioned earlier that nighttime users of social media have lower self-esteem. Part of that too is because we're tired, we're fatigued, we're not as able to have that positive self-talk. We're susceptible to just all of the messages and information that's going on out there. A lot of people, and I chose a young girl here because for young women, social media has a direct impact on body image. And when we look at that comparison trap, I really love this image of the little kitty who looks in the picture, or looks in the mirror and sees a lion and sees themselves as a lion. But here, the trick is that, or the tricky part about it is, we are comparing ourselves to the false representations of other people. And when we talk about body image, I hear a lot of athletes that are like, wow, but he's so big, or he's cut here, he's cut that way. But it's not real. So you're comparing yourself to fabricated pictures and fabricated muscles and fabricated routines, and you're chasing something that doesn't even exist. And that's the comparison trap. So yes, it's about, we should try not to compare ourselves to other people so much, but with social media, we're comparing ourselves to fabricated images and created images that aren't even real. And so people are falling lower with their self-esteem by trying to keep up with these different images, keep up with these different profiles, and it's really creating a big problem. So I will have the pleasure of kicking it off to Dr. Erin.
We're modeling flexibility up here today, actually. Sitting out of order, doing all the fun things. So I am Dr. Erin Haugen. So I'm a licensed psychologist in the state of North Dakota and also in Minnesota, but I'm actually physically located in Grand Forks, North Dakota. I am also a certified mental performance consultant, and I have the honor of being the director of mental health and performance psychology for the University of North Dakota Athletics and Sports Medicine Department. I'm also in private practice and then have my own consulting business as well. So as I'm sure all of these colleagues, we do all the things, right? Like we wear multiple hats. I'm sure all of you wear multiple hats as well. And so I actually kind of accidentally fell into sports psychology and working with athletes, and kind of accidentally fell into working with sports medicine. So our business, or the business that I work for, was housed in the same building as Team Physicians. And so naturally I would get referrals for student athletes. I was a high school athlete, although there was a rumor going around that I played collegiate sport. And I was like, bless all of you, I did not play collegiate sport. And so it became very evident that injury was an incredibly important role in the lives of student athletes. I know Dr. Candace, I believe Dr. Candace actually was the one who had asked, how many of you have experience with sport injury, right? That was my recollection from the back of the room, that most people have experience with sport injury. Most people that have been on the stage today have talked about injury, and it's an incredibly, incredibly powerful part in mental health and well-being. And I hope to kind of walk you through some of the reasons, and as well as kind of a little bit of a call to action about some of the ways that we can kind of show up a little bit more effectively for student athletes who are experiencing injury. So a phrase that we often use in kind of the injury world is that there's two kinds of athletes: those who have been injured and those who have not been injured yet. Almost every athlete experiences some type of sport injury. It can be something mild, a tweaked muscle, all the way up to something that's career-ending. And I think that the impact of the injury knows no bounds. I don't think it's a coincidence that when the athlete panel was up here, a lot of their stories took a turn when an injury happened, right? I'm sure we all can think about, whether it's ourselves, whether it's athletes we serve, that injury complicates the mental health and well-being process for student athletes. I want to talk very briefly about some kind of factors. I'm not going to go into all the different layers of this. This is from a sport injury model. There's a lot of different sport injury models out there, but there's a few factors from a psychological perspective that are really important. And the first one is cognitive appraisal. So that's just simply, how do we think about things? So for some athletes, they might recognize, that, oh, okay, that's just a tweaked muscle, that's not a big deal. Other athletes might think, crap, what does this mean? Am I going to be sidelined? Am I going to lose my spot? Am I going to be able to play professionally? And that cognitive appraisal, how we think about it, really, really matters in terms of emotions and behaviors. The thing about this cycle is that it happens for all of us with anything, right? Any of us have something happen or difficult happen, we stub our toe and we're like, man, right? Or we can be like, oh, hey, I just stubbed my toe, which is not how I respond to stubbed toes, by the way. I'm the cursing one. I get kind of crabby. So I got to be pretty on top of my cognitive appraisals. One of the phrases that I love, and I use this all the time, we are 0% responsible for what we feel, we're 50% responsible for what we think, and we're 100% responsible for what we do. Meaning, when we get to the emotion piece, emotions are good, emotions are healthy, we want emotion, we want to feel things. It's more about how we're interacting with those emotions and interacting with those thoughts that really matters, right? So we all have thoughts pop into our head all day long. Like I had mentioned, I'm from the stub toe crowd who's probably cursing. Then I catch myself and I say, whoa, hold on. That impacts how I feel, right? Or if I go with that like feistiness, that's probably not gonna result in a very happy moment for myself. But the part about this that I think is so important is the behavioral response. No matter what shows up for us, we can learn tools, we can learn techniques to navigate those difficulties. And I think that that's actually really, really, really important when it comes to injury, because a lot of injuries are unexpected. And so it feels very uncontrollable for a lot of athletes, but helping them recognize that we can influence how we show up to that, we can influence how we respond to that is so, so, so incredibly important. I want to kind of just talk about kind of three phases related to injury very, very broadly. The first part is the initial injury stage. It is intense. Whew. There's all the feels, right? Like we're scared, we're frustrated, we're confused. There's a lot going on. And so I think it's very common the research would tell us that it's very common for that to happen. Our experience tells us that it's common for that to happen. Again, emotions aren't bad, they're good, they're healthy. It's just data, right? It's data that the student athlete is saying, wow, something doesn't feel quite right. It's what we do with that data that really, really matters. Then we get to the rehab stage. There's a wide range of experiences of rehab, partially because there's wide ranges of injuries, right? Like sometimes it's just maybe we sit out practice. Other times we are having a year-long rehab when it comes to like ACL. Sometimes our career is ending and we have very significant impacts on our lives. One of the things that we know about kind of that rehab experience is that longer rehabs tend to have some bumps, right? It's harder to maintain motivation. It's harder to stay engaged in the process. I think one of the things about that early process and the big emotions, and then we get a plan, right? What do athletes like? They like plans. They like to work on things, right? If I do A, B, C, D happens. Right. Well, what if I'm in rehab and I do A, B, C, but F happens, or Z, right? What do I do with that? How do I respond to that? What's the plan? And then that starts that whole cycle going on and on and on again. And we can feel really paralyzed and really stuck and really confused. One of the things that we know about the kind of the middle part of rehab is that that's where a lot of the mental health concerns can often surface. The initial stages, there's just a lot of emotional intensity, which again, totally understandable. But as we navigate bumps and confusion and frustration, that longer stage of rehab, or when rehab is throwing us curveballs, right? Like, how many of you have had perfect courses of rehab, right? Not everybody. I mean, some, right? There are some, absolutely. A lot of times there's some bumps, or there's that expectation piece. We're comparing ourselves. One of the things that I have the honor of doing is doing injury support groups for student athletes. And one of the things that I see so often is, especially when athletes have similar injuries to a teammate or someone else that they know, there's a lot of comparison going on, right? Well, but my sister was at this stage at 6 months, or my friend was already back to sport. And so that comparison can really, really get in our heads. Social media, absolutely, we see people's best self on social media, and so that can be really, really hard because we have maybe unreasonable expectations for ourselves because everybody's body responds a bit differently. And then there's the last piece, return to sport. So I think a lot of times when we think about return to sport, right? Like, oh, yay, I'm going back to sport, that's awesome, that's wonderful. Well, yes, and we use "and" a lot in my office. There can be a lot of anxiety that shows up for athletes when we think about returning to sport, right? One of the biggest things that we find is fear of re-injury. What if I'm in this spot again? What if it's worse? What if, I've had 2 concussions? My doc told me when I get the 3rd, I have to retire, right? Worked with so many student athletes who are so concerned about that because then their life really changes. The other fears is also that fear of performance. So they've been going through rehab, adjusting, that kind of stuff. Their teammates, their competition, they've been playing at a high level. They've been doing different things than their teammates in their competition. So gosh, what if I'm not back to that same level that I was before? What if I can't do it? What if, you name the what ifs that they're there. So one of the things that I talk with athletes about a lot, and this is why my talk is titled Ready, Set, Return, is a lot of times athletes, when they're going through the rehabilitation process, are making a decision. And we assume, a lot of times in sport, that athletes are going to return to their sport, right? Why wouldn't they, right? Sport's amazing, sport's awesome. Of course they're gonna return. The reality is, it's a decision to return because there's gonna be some curveballs that are coming their way. And some athletes, if they're lucky, will be able to make the decision to retire. And I say if they're lucky because sometimes athletes are forced into retirement. And the reality is we know that involuntary retirement is associated with a host of challenges. For athletes that have that strong athletic identity, that are really tied to that athlete role, which, right, what athlete isn't, right? Like, I played high school sports, I did not play at the collegiate or above level. Like, I view myself as an athlete. Think about as we go along that progression, the environments that are in, a lot of our friends, family, a lot of us come from sport culture. So getting that stripped away, or that decision made for us, is very, very powerful. And we're gonna talk a little bit about some of those things that show up. I also want us to think about the decision to retire is not necessarily a bad decision, right? Especially if it's a decision. And even when it's involuntary, there's ways that we can talk to athletes or have conversations that help them prepare for retirement. I have problems with clickers. We've talked about pressure and identity so much, and I think partially because that's so central to the athlete experience. When we think about the decision to return or retire, I think the pressure that's there is who wants me to be back on the court or on the ice. A lot of times athletes, when they're injured, feel really guilty, right? Like, I'm not out there, I'm not supporting my teammates in the same way. What role do I have on the team? That also spills over into identity. Like, who am I? If I'm not out there on the track, on the court, on the field, on the ice, like, what role do I play? How do I matter? Do I matter? When we think about the different thoughts that show up, who am I is huge, right? I think anytime we have that strong identity or that strong piece, when that changes, like, I very strongly identify with being a psychologist. Gosh, when I retire, who am I? The spoiler is I'm going to be somebody who trains border collies. That's the spoiler, just so y'all know. but I've thought very intentionally about that, right? But a lot of times athletes haven't. We're talking about people who are typically youth sport or collegiate sport. Like, they're typically not at a stage of life where they would think about retirement, right? Like, they're dealing with things that a lot of us deal with much, much later on. Another one, who am I going to let down? There's a lot of people that are supported by, a lot of student athletes that are supported by people in their environment, a lot of people that really look up to them, kids, family members. As we've heard, people constantly asking about those athlete pieces. And then we're really taking on that burden. I think that's one of kind of the burden that athletes bear, is that there's actually a really good article about the model of elite athlete development. And one of the things that the authors talk about is that we're placing expectations and identities onto athletes at a very, very young age that they might not even know how to navigate. So those of us that are sharing sports spaces with them, part of our role is helping them figure out what do they need to take on, but more importantly, what do they not need to take on? This is by far, when an athlete is faced with the ability to make the decision about retirement, this is by far the biggest question, fear that I hear. They are so worried, and I work predominantly at the collegiate level, they are told over and over again, these are the best years of your life. Why wouldn't you take your 4, 5, 6, 7 years of eligibility? COVID, whole nother year, medical red shirt. I know, the math doesn't add up. There's a lot of years of college sport now. But that's the biggest one. What if I decide and I'm done and coach fills that spot on the roster? What do I do? One of the things I often tell athletes is if we really think about this, if we really ask ourselves the right questions, if we really build certain skills, you're going to feel good about retirement because it's a decision. And that's going to be something that we're going to talk about very, very, very quickly. And what if I'm not as good? We've already kind of talked about that a little bit. So there is some interesting research regarding ACL reconstruction. And one of the things that the researchers have found is that 45%, just under half, of athletes who undergo ACL reconstruction do not return to the competitive level of sport that they were at before. 45%. Nearly half. That's huge. Anyone have any ideas why? What's traumatic? Traumatic? Absolutely. Fear? Yep, absolutely. So you're tapping into one of the keys. Well, it's something more broadly called psychological readiness, poor psychological readiness. So what is psychological readiness? There you go, right? So we talked already about the emotions, right? Low levels of fear, confidence, right? Belief in our body's ability to navigate that. High self-efficacy, seeing themselves as being able to do the things that they need to do, and high motivation to do it. So these people who have good psychological readiness, they're ready to hit the ground running, they know what they need to do, they're ready for the challenge, right? But the problem is, we don't focus on that in sport terribly often. More often than not, what I see is right before we return to sport, they're having some feelings and people are like, oh my gosh, they're stressed. We have to figure this out. Absolutely, I will have those conversations at any point in time. I think anytime we talk about psychological readiness, it's awesome. But I think we really need to think a little bit more holistically about psychological readiness and how we build that in athletes, because the reality is psychological readiness is a trainable skill. It's actually several trainable skills. And we can help athletes learn these, build these, if they're returning to sport, and also if they're going to be retiring. These are trainable skills that will be helpful to mental health and well-being. So the last thing that I will leave you with is I am a huge, huge fan of proactively talking about building psychological readiness for whatever is to come, whether it's return to sport, whether it's retirement, and I think we need to be doing this from day one. Day one of injury. I love the idea of talking about retirement from day one of collegiate sport. It's hilarious when I'm working with a freshman athlete and I talk about retirement, they're like, Erin, what, no. I know, hear me out, right? Like, athletes are going to retire. We're not gonna do this for as long as we might do other careers. That's okay, that's just the nature of the game. That's the nature of what we do. And so I really want to call us to think about how we can build those skills for psychological readiness throughout the sport experience. Because I think it's really, really important, especially when we tell athletes these are trainable skills. This is not something that magically happens. Sometimes it might, but I guarantee athletes are probably doing things that they don't even realize they're doing. But helping them realize that this is something that we can build and grow and we can work on. And I leave you with pictures of my adorable border collies, because I told myself I will show pictures of my dogs in every presentation that I give. I do occasionally forget, but they're very happy to be in your space. And want to thank you all for being such wonderful humans and caring so much about athlete mental health and well-being. Cool. Q&A. So Q&A, apparently. Cool.
Oh, we got a Q&A. All right, cool.
Hi. So I am curious as to whether or not psychological readiness is a transferable skill, and if it's something we could use as staff. Because not that I'm thinking about retiring, but I'm also, like, I don't want to come to work on Tuesdays. So that's my question.
So we don't have research looking at that, but absolutely, experientially, I would absolutely say it's a transferable skill. These are things that we can use in any domain of life. I think they're really tied to performance and well-being. So yes, please do, share it wide, broadly, all the humans using psychological readiness, build psychological readiness. I think that's actually a really, really awesome thing.
The former shares today and the whole context that we're working on here, but the context of the injury in particular, was it in the sport, outside of the sport? Was it something traumatic, an assault, something like that, that takes away all of those familiar resources and alienates? Would it have changed complete day-to-day living where, the loss of limb, right, loss of function, this sort of thing? And, is age considered an injury, is the question. But I have really been lucky to have experience at the USOC, and the psychologists there for years had helped us prepare for the end game. And even any conflict is very similar to have a plan and have it be flexible and take it all into account.
Right.
Back to the resource, back to the drawing board, should something change. And because of some rule changes in sport too, I've actually had to end my career and come back before. And so I've conceptualized the ending of sport before. But I guess the question was mostly, would the context of where the injury occurred, or would it be including social, psychological, trauma injuries, PTSD factor, because the body keeps the score sort of thing?
Absolutely. Context, like as Kevin's talked about, as we've certainly heard from a lot of presenters, context is so important. And so I think as in talking more specifically about kind of more traumatic injuries, that there is actually some research out there looking at prevalence of PTSD post-injury, and it can be pretty high actually, 25, I think, to like 40%, depending on the nature of the injury.
Something like rape or molestation?
Absolutely, yeah. I... Yep, absolutely. No, I think anything that really kind of disrupts the process for an athlete, I think is really important. And so whether that's, a sport-related injury, other, loss of housing or things like that, I think anything that we can do to help them build skills and navigate those transitions, I think is really important.
So I have a question that kind of combines a couple of ideas, really relating to future Dr. Sumler, what you were talking about with social media and NIL. We know that athletes have to start thinking about themselves as a brand. As much as we want to detach that idea and disrupt it, it's really difficult with legislation that is pushing for them to have a brand, and conversations and visual images on social media about the benefits of being a brand. But I also like the idea of the psychological readiness as kind of maintaining kind of that control. So it's maybe a combination of what you two were talking about. How do you think or posit that we can use psychological readiness as an idea to disrupt the control that social media has on our athletes, in particular, thinking about age and development, like that 16 to 24 range? What are your ideas that we can maybe take back that are tangible?
Yeah, I think what was coming to me in terms of building a brand, the risk with young athletes trying to build a brand is they're trying to build a brand before they know who they are or what their brand stands for. And so with NIL stuff, when we look at identity development, many of them are thrust into creating these brands and these profiles. And then it changes, of course, as they grow and develop a year later. And so now they feel tied to what they put out or this persona of an athlete that they put out last year, and that's changed. So I don't have a solution. I have added problems. But I think that the concern about NIL in terms of identity development is, again, they have not spent the time or have the psychological readiness to understand who they are before engaging in NIL or kind of brand management.
And to your point, I actually, as you were talking, I was like, I think you've helped us identify a research collaboration, actually. So that's how my brain is working right now. There hasn't been any research looking at that, but I think it's important, right? I mean, we can think about psychological readiness for so many things, and I think one of the things that was so striking when you were talking about social media, these are things like I'm not in their demographic. Like I've got a few years on, I think probably everyone, and so they're navigating things that we can't even fathom, and so I think anything that we can do to build up, whether we call it psychological readiness, resilience, I think that's what we're really all called to do.
We have one online. We had someone online ask, any suggestions in navigating social media with teen athletes?
Yes, I was going to save some solutions for our latter panel, so I'm sure someone will cover it. But in terms of all the things you can do to moderate that use, and any increasing awareness about your use, being mindful of how much you use. So I always talk to athletes about, let's just start by looking at your screen time and asking yourself, are you satisfied with that? And if not, we need to do something about it. If you are, it might be working for you. So I think, one, increasing your awareness around how you're using social media and being more mindful in that engagement. And then, of course, using all of the features, being aware of like the notifications, and maybe you set some type of routine where it's like post-game, I don't open any social media apps that have them locked, or notifications are turned off for an X amount of time following a game or before a game. So trying to help them, again, psychological readiness, prepare for what's to come, and building up that kind of protective factor in terms of social media. I think it's available.
There was another one online. What do you see as key skills of psychological readiness?
Ooh, yes. Well, actually, and Dr. Candace had actually talked about, using things like imagery self-talk. Those are kind of some tools that we use a lot of times in psychology to kind of help build those. More broadly, I think it's about having the difficult conversations from day one, being willing to enter into those spaces about like, hey, how are you doing? How are you functioning? You look tired, you look stressed. How is this injury impacting you? I really think of it as this ongoing series of conversations, and I think that ongoing series of conversations will illuminate all sorts of things. One of my favorite quotes by Maya Angelou, who said it much better than I'm going to paraphrase it, but people don't remember what you said or what you did, but they remember how you made them feel. And so I think it's really how we can all show up to those spaces, and the athletes will tell us what they need and the skills that we can build. And I think that that's really kind of the best thing that we can do.
In my listening to what you were each saying, all four of you, I was really struck by the fact that you each talked about purpose. Dr. Chapman said that, what is the purpose of sport in the first place? And we heard about thinking about the purpose of your body and the purpose of social media and the purpose when you have to make decisions at inflection points. Do any of you have some advice for us, for the student athletes in our lives? How do we help raise them up to 30,000 feet every once in a while above their life and connect them or help them connect to whatever their purpose is?
And for me, we're gonna go.
No, you go ahead.
For me, I think the first thing that comes to mind, so in terms of social media, is trying to educate them on ways that they can connect with others or kind of see other folks, experts in the area, or the kind of professional athletes, and how they're using their outlets and their platforms to engage in other causes. And I think, in terms of helping them establish purpose outside of sport, introducing them. So some of the homework that I give them is I want you to go to a different student organization, or I want you to go to this part of campus and meet somebody new or meet 3 new people. They don't have those tools. So meeting them where they are and giving them the tools to expand their network so that they can start to learn about other interests and passion areas.
I really like that. I was just going to say, I think, for me, I work from an ACT perspective, acceptance and commitment therapy. And so values, I think, was the thing that came to mind first, Dr. G. And, I think helping them have a space to really identify what their values are, both in sport and out of sport. And I think that very much aligns with what Charron said, that helping them do things that are not just related to their team or to their everyday routine of competition. It's finding other hobbies, other interests, other people to follow on social media, other things, history, art, animals, whatever that might be, right? But really helping provide and encourage a space to empower them to discover for themselves who are they outside of sport. And coincidentally and ironically, performance we actually see improve when that happens and that balance occurs. So.
Very true. All right, did y'all enjoy the panel? Yeah. All right, so we have one more question?
One more question.
All right.
This is a social media question. I'm involved in a summer camp, and we take the cell phones and unplug the kids when they come to the camp while they're there. A little girl came to me when it was time to go home, and she was about 13, and she was in tears. 1, because she was sad to leave, but 2, I said, "Sweetheart, what's the matter?" She goes, "I'm afraid to have my phone back." It was very, you can tell it was very emotional for her, and here I am, 58. I have no idea what to tell her, So how do you take kids and give them the confidence, or take that anxiety away from them, of waking up in the morning, which I'm sure she would feel, to looking at social media and to be scared of it now that she'd been away from it?
Yeah, I mean, you're hitting the point that it's really become a security blanket. And I talked about it before, but we're relying on this device to soothe us. So it makes sense of why she's anxious. I saw a study that said 40% of people are anxious away from their phones. She was anxious to come back to it, but some of us are anxious just being away from it. So I think it's less about what we can take away and more about what we can add. So we need to increase their coping skills and increase their resources. So maybe it's not worried about taking their phone away, but it's like, hey, why don't after practice for 15 minutes, let's stop and do some belly breathing, and then you get to your phone. Trying to instill some protective measures around their social media. So again, we're not gonna be able to take social media away, but how can we help them engage with it in a positive way?
And I think something we'll talk about later, hopefully during the solutions panel too, to add to that real quick, is keep in mind that although we all know that all athletes are created equal, all athletes have different predispositions and learning experiences. And I think we often forget that. Like, one athlete is not going to struggle with that. Another athlete might struggle with that if you do a decision tree for a whole lot of reasons that we have to explore by building a relationship with them, right? So, again, I see that with some athletes as emotional avoidance. I see some athletes who engage in checking behaviors like within OCD. There's a lot of reasons, right? And I think that as we explore with each individual athlete, many of the things we've shared today with the Q&A, that we all have different predispositions, we all have different traits, and I think those interactions with sport create many of the manifestations that we're talking about today. So that's another point that I'd add. All right. Okay, go ahead, and then we'll wrap up after this question.
Related to injury and expertise, because with trauma, I have found it very often that athletes won't put their phone down or even consider it, although that's for eye movement that's really contraindicated for recovering from brain trauma. So they could have real health issues with
Yep. All right, well, we appreciate you all. We're not done, but we are done right now because I hear y'all's stomachs from here. So we're going to break for lunch here in a second. We're going to hear from Jen.
Thank you all so much. We do have lunch waiting for you. There are sandwiches, there's salads. Please go help yourself. We have about a half hour, a little bit less, because we had such great conversation. So go ahead, get yourself some lunch. We'll meet you back here in about a half hour. Thank you so much.